anyway, so I wanted to talk today about the natural beauty of Alaska and things that people go to Alaska to see. So, as I said a moment ago, Alaska is a place that is, see if I can get my slide to, there we go. So, here's a map of Alaska. And it is a country, a state that is very difficult to get to from the main part of the United States. So it's really sort of a dream vacation for a lot of people. It's very expensive to get there. It's not something the average person probably does. And most people get there by cruise ship because traveling overland is difficult and even flying there is difficult. So for many people, the way they get there is to fly into Seattle, Washington, and they take a cruise ship from there. And then even with the cruise ship, you have to make decisions about how much time you can spend there and where you want to go because you can't see it all, obviously. And if you're going along with most of the cruise ships, you're going to be, of course, floating along the coast and making stops along the coast, but you're not going to be going into the interior very deeply. And so people have to make choices about what they want to see. It is a place that some people go if they're outdoorsy and they like outdoor activities, hiking, camping, fishing, those kinds of things. There are lots of those kinds of activities in Alaska. In the warm months, those are places that those kinds of activities are offered. But for, someone who just wants to take in the beauty of the area, there's a lot to do there as well. And it's easy to do it through a cruise ship where you literally wake up every morning and you open the window and you see something beautiful outside. So you don't have to be a mountain climber or a hiker to go and enjoy the beauty there, but it is something that some people like to do. So as one of the people in the audience mentioned, of course, I'm sure all of you know that Alaska used to be a part of Russia. Russia had established a presence there in the late 1700s and through the first half of the 19th century. And then eventually the United States purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867. And as I mentioned, that was the subject of my book. And I'll just make a sort of a quick side note here. I got interested in the Alaska purchase when I myself was taking a cruise to Alaska. So my family was taking a cruise, and I realized that I didn't know a lot about the Alaska purchase, and it seemed like something I should know more about. And when we stopped in Sitka, and unfortunately that little red circle on the map moved when I put this in presentation mode. It's supposed to be around the city of Sitka. When I stopped in the city of Sitka, there was one little bookstore, and I went in there thinking I would be able to easily find a book that would tell the story of the Alaska purchase, and I discovered there was nothing there. And then when I got home from this trip, I did some research, and I found out that the last book had been written in English in 1975 in the United States. And so I proposed to the University of Alaska Press that I write a book about this, and they thought that was a good idea. And at the time, we were coming up on the anniversary, the 150th anniversary of the Alaska purchase, and so the timing was perfect, and it worked out wonderfully. And of course, then it got me interested in learning more about Alaska and especially appreciating it in a different way, I think. So Alaska, of course, became part of the United States in 1867. It was very sparsely populated for decades, as you might imagine. It was difficult territory for settlers, mostly adventurers, mostly men at first. Of course, there was a native population there, and I don't want to ignore that. But in terms of Americans moving there, it was a very difficult place to set up home. And so initially there were mostly men going there. Eventually some people brought wives, or some of the men married into the local population, either the local native population or the Russian population, which had been there for decades, as I said. And so, the population did begin to grow, but initially the United States government took very little interest in the area in terms of, helping to establish local government and that sort of thing, because there just weren't very many people. over time, of course, that changed. And part of what helped that change was the discovery of gold. Now, they already knew that they had lots of other natural riches there, lumber, furs. They began to discover things like silver and other precious metals. But then in 1896, the big gold rush began in Alaska, and that's when they began to discover huge amounts of gold. And then, of course, lots of people began to move there. And then the government had a more significant interest in establishing some control there. I know that probably all of you know as well that Alaska is known for oil. That did not happen until much later, though. So the discovery of oil didn't happen until the 1960s. So let me move on and show you a couple of pictures from Sitka. So Sitka was the capital of Russian America. And when you first arrive in Sitka from the water, you are confronted with this interesting totem pole. So this is, I think this is particularly interesting because it is a combination of local tradition and Russian imperial presence. So you see what looks like a traditional totem pole, but then in the middle is the Russian imperial double-headed eagle. So that's sort of a very interesting sign of the former presence of the Russians. One thing that I did discover when I was there, and it might have changed since I was there because it has been a while, is there wasn't as much of a Russian presence as I thought there would be. So, or lingering presence, I should say. So when I arrived there with my family, none of whom had been to Russia. Well, my husband had been to Russia, but my children hadn't. I was really hoping I'd be able to take them to a Russian restaurant or something like that. And there really wasn't much like that. There were some monuments that were noting the presence of the Russians here. So here's a statue of Alexander Baranov with a little plaque. And there, certainly there's an acknowledgement of the former presence of the Russians here. But in terms of like feeling that there was a lot of Russian history here or culture here, that really wasn't the case. And again, it may have changed since I was there last, but that was something that surprised me. These are just some views of Sitka. So immediately when you enter into that area of water that brings you toward Alaska, you start to see these amazing scenes. And I really am not exaggerating when I say that on this cruise ship, every morning I would open the curtains and, we would just marvel at what we were seeing outside because every day the scenery was spectacular. Now, one of the things that Alaska is known for is its mountains, and they have over 50 mountains. Obviously, I'm not going to name them all, but there are lots of mountains here, and it creates part of that spectacular scenery that is just present everywhere you look. So this mountain, Mount Edgecombe, is one of the ones that you can see when you arrive in Sitka. And as you can see, it's 3,202 feet tall. And it's actually a former volcano or a dormant volcano. And it last erupted 4,000 years ago. And you can tell by looking at the top of it. And I'm not a geologist and I won't pretend to be one, but you can tell by looking at the top of that there had been an explosion there at some point, right? Because a chunk is missing off the top. Now, another very famous mountain in Alaska is Mount McKinley, or that's what it was originally known. It's the highest peak in North America. It was named, it had been known by the local population as Denali, but then in 1896, a gold prospector named it Mount McKinley after the then presidential candidate. And that is the name that it was known by for many, many years, beginning in 1917, when it became a national park. Now, since then, in 2015, the name was changed to Denali, and now it is Mount Denali in Denali National Park, although you will sometimes still hear people referring to it as Mount McKinley if they are just not aware that the name has changed. I do want to use that particular story to just acknowledge again the presence of native populations here. I think that when we talk about Alaska, this question comes up a lot. What did the local people think about the sale? Well, no one cared what they thought, and that's a harsh reality of that time period. There were people who had been living there for ages, and no one really thought about that, right? The Russians came and they established a foothold there, and then the United States purchased the territory from Russia, and no one really consulted the native population. And so it's not at all unusual to see that, the native population had a name already for this mountain, and, we just ignored that. Here's another picture of Mount McKinley. You can see its height is 20,310 feet above sea level. So it is a really, really impressively tall mountain. So another thing that I'm sorry, not Russia, Alaska is known for are its glaciers. And it's estimated that there are over 100,000 glaciers, which cover about 23,000 square miles of territory. Now, one thing I learned when I was putting together this presentation is that, glaciers are both inland and also, some of them feed out into the water directly, right? So when we talk about 100,000 of these, most of these are inaccessible and are, have been counted by aerial footage, right? Nobody can really get to a lot of these because they're so far into the interior. Only the most intrepid can get there. So most of the glaciers that are in this number are never going to be seen by the average person, but there are definitely some that are widely visible and are tourist attractions. Another thing that I was reading about in preparing for this talk is about the retreat of glaciers. So, of course, I knew that was an ongoing issue. There is a great concern about what global climate change is doing to all of these kinds of things, glaciers, and and the melting of them. And so I was looking at some of the averages, and in Alaska, at least, they are estimating that glaciers are retreating about 3 miles over the last 40 years. Now, that doesn't seem like much, but at that rate, you can see how in some cases those glaciers will be disappearing. And then, of course, and they worry about it for tourism reasons, but they're also worried about what that does to the local environment as well, because of course, when retreating means melting means water can mean flooding, it means the changing of the terrain, the changing of the overall environment, which affects animals, which affects plant life, and all these sorts of things. So it is something that is, I read up a bit, it's something that's being constantly monitored, constantly measured, and it is a huge concern for places like Alaska, where so much of the land is affected by this kind of thing. So let's look at a couple of the glaciers in particular, the ones that are tourist attractions and widely accessible. So this one is called Mendenhall Glacier. It was named after a man named Thomas Mendenhall, who served as the superintendent of the U.S. Coast Guard and Geodetic Survey at the end of the 19th century. It's about 13.6 miles long. So again, when we talk about the retreat of 3 miles over 40 years, that doesn't seem like much, but if your glacier is only 13.5 miles long, then basically in a century, it'll be almost entirely gone. So that is something that obviously is a big concern. And this particular glacier, it's been, measured or estimated that it has retreated already 2 miles in the last 100 years. So the fear is that with time and without any kind of changes, it will disappear eventually. And this one is, you can see this one's from near Juneau, and I'll pull up a map in just a second again. So this is one that when people go to Juneau, Alaska as part of their Alaskan cruise or Alaskan vacation, it's accessible usually by some kind of bus trip, or if you've rented a car, you can get there and walk around the area, and you can get pretty close to the base of the glacier. Now, one particularly amazing display of glaciers is an area called Glacier Bay. And I will pull up a map here so you can see where that is. So you can see here where Vancouver is to kind of situate you. And this whole area, this area that's, Hubbard Glacier, Glacier Bay, this whole area is where most of the cruises take place, because there are so many stops along the way that are easily accessible. They've become very common cruise ship stops, and it's just rich with natural beauty and wonderful things to see. And so this is where a lot of those vacations take place. So you can see where Juneau is. We just saw where Mendenhall Glacier was, and now we're at Glacier Bay. So Glacier Bay has over 1,000 glaciers in this one small area. And you can see in 1980, it became a national park, and it's just so spectacularly beautiful. Some of the most amazing photos that I took were in Glacier Bay. I mean, this is my photo, which is just unbelievable. And you go into this bay and you're just surrounded by glaciers and all of these incredibly beautiful sights. And it's really almost too beautiful to believe. And if it's very quiet, as you can imagine, surrounded by ice like that. And if you look in the water, you see lots and lots of chunks of ice. And these chunks of ice have come through the process known as calving. And calving is when a chunk of an iceberg or a chunk of a glacier breaks away and falls into the water and then, floats around. And sometimes these calves can be enormous and sometimes they can be pretty small. So here you can see lots of small bits. But as we floated in Glacier Bay, we were fortunate enough to actually hear and see calving taking place. And I tried to get the best photos here, but it's very difficult to capture. But basically what would happen is we would hear a noise that sounded like a cannon firing. And then, we would quickly look and try and figure out where the noise had come from. And if you were quick and you managed to figure that out, you would actually see chunks of ice falling off of the glaciers and splashing into the water. And the cannon sound was the cracking. So that was a pretty amazing thing to see. And I've got pictures. Let me go back one second. I've got pictures from several of the glaciers doing this, and it was a pretty impressive thing to watch. So just north of Glacier Bay, as I showed you on the map, is Hubbard Glacier. Again, you can see how amazing this glacier is. Very, very beautiful and very thick. Again, that's another thing when we talk about global climate change. It's not just about the retreating of the ice from open water, but it's also about the thinning of the ice. So I'm pretty sure this is the one that I read is 350 feet thick above the water and 250 feet thick below the water. So it's very thick and dense, obviously. Eventually, though, that if that ice thins, then that, of course, makes it more susceptible to retreat and to calving. So just like if you have a big chunk of ice, it takes longer to melt than a bunch of little pieces of ice, right? That's what happens here as well. This ice, some of this ice is, hundreds and hundreds of years old. It gets packed very tightly, very densely. It freezes over and over again. And so it gets harder and harder. But when, over time, if it melts, then that erodes the glacier, and then you start to see the further weakening of the ice. So again, here's that map that shows you Hubbard Glacier, where we're located here. And this I thought was a particularly interesting thing. So Hubbard Glacier is named after a man named Gardner Hubbard. He was a lawyer and a financier who who was one of the founders and the first president of the National Geographic Society and also of the Bell Telephone Company. But the connection that I did not know about was that his daughter married let me go back. His daughter married Alexander Graham Bell, the man credited with founding the telephone. So I thought that was a very interesting connection. Now, Hubbard Glacier is, you can see on this map to the right, it's very deep in terms of its reach inland. And that's, that's not always the case with these glaciers. It really does depend on each individual glacier. And you can also see from the map of glaciers to the right, what I was saying earlier, how you do have these glaciers that are interior that are probably never going to be accessed or seen by the average person, right? But they are still considered, they are still counted among that huge number of glaciers. So here's just another beautiful, beautiful picture of Hubbard Glacier. And there's another picture of calving. This was, I think, one of the most just unique things that I'd ever experienced. I really thought that it was amazing. And everybody out on the deck would just sort of ooh and ah the way people do with fireworks when this would happen. Now, of course, the other thing that people love to go to Alaska to see is the wildlife. And as I mentioned to you before, if you are that kind of person who loves to hike and sort of do the more adventurous kind of things, there are lots and lots of activities that you can do here. Even if you are visiting Russia, gosh, sorry, I keep saying that, visiting Alaska by cruise ship, you can take excursions that will bring you inside into areas where you can do some of these things. So one of the big things that people love to do when they go to Alaska, and this of course is true in other places as well, but Alaska is one of those places where people love to go whale watching. And it's very common to see whales there. The two most common types of whales that are there are gray whales and humpback whales. And even when you're out at sea on the giant cruise ship, you can sometimes see them. But certainly then when you get closer to the land, there are these encounters with whales that are unbelievable. This one was taken from like one of those whale watching boats. It was very close to the boat. And of course, you've probably seen photos of this kind of thing on the internet where people sometimes are in, whale watching boats and the whales come incredibly close and they splash and everybody, loses their minds because it's pretty amazing to see something so big close to your boat. But yeah, then that one, I did not see that. I actually lifted that picture because I wasn't fortunate enough to see anything like this. But and of course it's not guaranteed. You can go out on a whale watching boat and not see anything, but it is one of the, I think, probably biggest kinds of things that people do when they go to Alaska, if they're not up for some hard hiking. The other thing that you see a lot of in Alaska along the coastline are sea lions. And you can see there's an estimated 54,000 sea lions. And these guys are just very cute. They just lay around on the rocks and look like giant garden snails, garden slugs. They're not a threat to anyone. I mean, you wouldn't want to go and mess with them, but they're not a threat to anyone. Although you may have seen in the news recently that in California, there's a place right now that's having a problem with so many sea lions coming inland and climbing up on the docks and everything. This is in San Francisco, I think they're having that problem right now. And it's just something they kind of have to tolerate until the sea lions decide to go away. So there are a lot of sea lions in Alaska, and we did see them, in a variety of places. For example, on the left here, just sunning themselves on one of these markers in a harbor somewhere. Another creature that you see a lot of in Alaska are seals. Again, these are, not a danger to anyone, but I wouldn't go and interact with them unless I knew that that was okay. Really, you're not supposed to interact with any of these animals because although they're not endangered, right, there are rules about how we take care of them. There are over 150,000 seals. I think most of them are harbor seals in Alaska. And again, you see them all over the place, in the harbors, and even out in sea, open sea, you would see these sort of popping their little heads up, sometimes, investigating what was going on. Now, one thing that people really love to do in Alaska is fish. And so Alaska is known for not only for fishing as a hobby or an adventure, but of course it's something that they produce for income. Of course, Alaska is really famous for its salmon. And the salmon there is amazing, but of course people also go there to fish other things. And so some of the things that are most common are rainbow trout and cod. That picture on the left was actually taken on an excursion that my daughter and I went on that was all about the wildlife of Alaska. And they did release that fish afterwards, but the guy would just throw a line in the water and he would catch a fish within seconds. So there's an abundance of fish there. And so that's why a lot of people like to go there. If they're big fisherman types, people will go there as a vacation destination. And of course, that's why it's such a great industry for the state, because at least now, hopefully that won't change. At least now they have a lot of fish there, and it makes for a good part of their economy. Now, of course, people also love to see some of the wild birds in Alaska, and I'll just focus in on two in particular, the bald eagle. So, the eagle, of course, has always been a bird that's meant a lot to the United States, not just because it's our national bird, but because it is a very, impressive and majestic bird. An eagle's wingspan can be 7.5 feet, which is, of course, much taller than the average human being. So that's pretty big. It's no longer an endangered species, at least at the moment. But again, like so many of the other animals that I'm mentioning here, they may not be endangered, but they are, of course, being closely counted and watched. And there are lots of laws about what you can and can't do with regards to these animals. It's estimated at the moment that there are 30,000 eagles living in Alaska. And we did see some, and people are, of course, always have their eyes peeled for those. And if you're with any kind of tour guide person, they will certainly point them out to you. But we did see eagle there, and it was pretty amazing. So these are something that people are always on the lookout for in Alaska as well. The other bird that I wanted to talk about is just the puffin, because I think they're incredibly cute. And we did see some of these. The puffins are little seabirds that are only about 16 inches high. So they're very small and cute with their big orange bills. It's estimated that there are about 250,000 of them living in Alaska. They, in the past, they were certainly used as a food source for the local population, but that has pretty much died out at this point, although it's not impossible for that to be the case sometimes, but it's just not common anymore the way it would have been before. Again, they're not endangered species, but there are rules about what you can do with all of these animals. See the next one, there's another picture of the puffins. So we did see quite a few of these while we were there. Now, of course, one thing that everybody knows about Alaska is that there are lots of bears. As you can see, there are about 140,000 total estimate of bears living in just Alaska. Alaska is home to 3 different types of bears, or all 3 different types of bears: black bears, brown bears, and polar bears. Now, you're not likely to see a bear in Alaska unless you go on an adventure that takes you into the woods someplace. They're not just. Hello? Hello? Is everything okay?
Yes, I mute someone.
Oh, okay. All righty. You're not likely to run into these just anywhere. But of course, as we see happening in lots of places, occasionally a bear does wander into town somewhere. and can wreak a little havoc, get into a house, get into a car, that sort of thing. This, of course, is, happening all over the world. It's just the inevitable intersection between animals and humans as our living space expands, and we are encroaching on what used to be their living space. So it does happen occasionally that, a bear wanders out into a town or something like that, but it's not, it's not a huge occurrence. And I mean, frankly, while we were there for 2 weeks, we never saw a bear. So it's not the way it is, the way you might picture it. There, cities are very much cities, even small ones are very much cities, and you don't see a lot of wildlife internally within the cities. Wolves, of course, are also traditional inhabitants of Alaska. Their numbers are pretty steady. Again, they're not endangered, but you can't just go around shooting them willy-nilly. It's about 9,000 estimated wolves. And again, the same story with wolves as it is with bears. There are occasionally situations where a wolf crosses a boundary in terms of where it goes, or it maybe attacks a person or a domestic pet or something, and then there's an uproar over it. But for the most part, the wolves stay where they should be, or where their homes are, and they don't intersect with human beings too much. But occasionally it does happen, and that will usually make the news, of course. Moose, of course, are the other animals that we see in Alaska. And I will say that, when we were on our trip, more than once, people did see moose in town, in some of these small coastal towns. As you can see, there's an estimate of about 175,000 of these. They are, for the most part, harmless, right? They're not carnivores. They're not going to chase down a human being to eat them, but they also are enormous. So they can be 6 to 8 feet tall, anywhere from 800 to 1,600 pounds. And so if you see one of these, you definitely want to stay away from it. You do not want to approach it. You don't want to get between it and its baby. You just don't want to get within its reach at all. But they do wander into town sometimes, and people are stupid and get too close to them. So, you see these stories, I'm sure, you see it in the news about what happens in the United States in some of our national parks. People get too close to animals, and then they are surprised when the animal reacts badly and they get, run down or gored or something else. Well, the same is true in Alaska, right? Alaska is, one giant group of, national parks, natural, environments with lots of animals. So occasionally there are stories of people doing something really stupid and getting too close to one of these. But if you keep your distance, you're probably absolutely fine. And they are amazingly, they're very interesting creatures, huge and really, really beautiful to see. So as long as you keep your distance from these, you're just absolutely fine. So that is where I'm going to stop today, and leave time for questions. As you can see, there is a ton of stuff to see in Alaska. It is, I focused on the natural wonders, the natural beauty, but there are a number of lovely small towns. The towns, with the exception of Juneau and Anchorage, do tend to be very small. And but they're lovely small towns, lots of things to do, especially if you're interested in getting out into nature, hiking, zip lining, all those kinds of things. There are all sorts of natural kind of adventures that you can engage in there in Alaska.